we then following a specific framework, we created these multiple episodes, like little audio podcasts. So when they opt in, instead of just getting a bunch of emails, they're actually getting access to this downloaded audio that lands right into their favorite podcast players. If you're a podcaster, it can sit right in their Apple Podcast app right next to yours. But it basically takes them on a journey. So we follow a specific framework. But the cool thing is, Alicia, is that it gives you the opportunity, like after they finish, let's say episode 1, they get through it at the end. You're like, okay, here's 5 things that you can do to take what you just learned and implement into your life. Shoot me an email once you implement that and let me know what happens, or shoot me an email if you have any questions about that, or DM me on Instagram, however you like to communicate. So it opens the door for a 2-way conversation, but it's not a selling conversation. It's a serving conversation.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. This conversation with Evans may just change your podcast. And no, I'm not saying that in a dramatic way. I really, truly believe that this conversation is going to make a difference in how you approach your content, how you approach your listeners, and how you can make the most of your podcast. So in this episode, Evans and I are talking about some of those problems and mistakes that podcasters tend to make when they are trying to make the most of their show. We talk about Evan's unique podcast ATM model. And before you think, oh, these are going to be gross selling tactics, I promise that Evans approaches podcasting from a place of serving first. And the way that he takes his listeners into leads, and then even those leads in continuously serving them with valuable content, is definitely inspiring. And I'm excited for you to hear this. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Evans to the podcast. Hello, Evans. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I'm so excited to talk to you. If you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your business.
Oh, thank you, Alicia. So my name is Evans Putman, and I consider myself more of a business consultant and coach for entrepreneurs who are looking to use podcasting, either as a host or a guest, to grow their business, right? To get the real, not necessarily to grow their brand or to get more exposure, but actually get a real ROI, to get leads, to get sales. Yeah, so that's what I do, and I love doing it. I've been in the business for a while, and it all started from me actually stumbling and fumbling my way through a podcast and learning this unique method, which I'm sure we'll go into. And from there, it's like, I just want to go share this with more people. So I started going out and teaching it, and that's what I do now. I have Podcast Profit School that I've founded, and I just love working with entrepreneurs with big positive messages and missions who are looking to create impact and change more lives. And that's sort of my lane that I like to play in, is with those people. So, but thank you for having me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, I love everything you do because it's very similar to the way that we work with our clients. And that strategy side, so many production companies tend to not offer that. And so I'm sure a lot of your clients have someone handling the production of their stuff, but they need you, right? Because a lot of those production businesses, they're not looking at the strategy. They're not looking at how to make the most of your show. It's just like, hand me the stuff and I'll edit it. Whereas our side, we tend to focus really heavily on like, are you making the most of your show? Are you turning your listeners into leads? Hence the title of the podcast. But yes, I love also that you mentioned the values behind it, right? Of working with people who are making a difference in the world, which definitely aligns with what we're trying to do here as well. So tell me a little bit about your secret sauce to podcasting. And you have something that you call your unique podcast ATM model. Now, does that work specifically just for hosts, or is it for guests as well? Or is there kind of a combination?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And it's funny because just generally in the beginning, I was using this only for podcast hosts. And then I had a couple people come in my world who like, I want to join your program, but I don't have a podcast. And here's why I want to do that. Because they had known me and they sort of knew where it came from and they jumped in. They were using podcast guesting to grow their business. They came in my world and I started looking at it. I was like, if I back this up a little bit, it actually does when I simplify, because it's a simple 3-step model. It works for anybody who just wants to get more clients from podcasts. So yeah, to answer your question, it sort of evolved through time. And thanks to the people, you probably experience the same thing. Sometimes when you teach others, all of a sudden you start to become the student. And you're like,
yes,
wow, I just caught something new. I didn't even think of it that way. So yeah, so it's called the Podcast ATM model. And that is thanks to my former client and then business partner, Pat Hyben, for the business. It's sort of how I got into podcasting, where he said this one time. And I was just like, thank you for saying that. I'm taking that. That's like the coolest thing ever, where he was sharing sort of a case study success story for me after I left the business that we had built together to go teach people what we had done, what we had created. He got on there and he said, it's sort of like I can get on the microphone and share my message and my mission, do what I love to do to serve others. And in the background, there's this system that's automatically growing the podcast, getting leads, bringing in sales. It's almost like you've turned my podcast into a virtual ATM. And I was like, ooh, I like that. Can I take that and turn that into the name of my business model? So it's sort of like I think of it like nicknames. Like it's sort of cheesy to give yourself a nickname. It's really cool when other people give you the nickname. So I was like, that's even cooler that you gave me the name of this business model from the experience that we had. So I just ran with it at that point. I was like, everybody knows what an ATM is, at least now. Maybe my daughter, who's just getting ready to turn 13, by the time she gets older, she'll be like, what the heck is that thing? Right.
Right.
So that's where it came from.
Oh, I love that. Let's go ahead and break those down. What are those, the three steps that you recommend that people do? And then I've got some questions on the content side. So you mentioned you get on the mic and you talk about what you love. A lot of people, they get to that point, but they're not clear on their message, which is such disappointment, right? Like you want these people to show up as like so great. They know what they're talking about. They're excited about the message. So I'm sure we'll talk about that. But let's go through the 3 steps that you have for your ATM model.
Sure, absolutely. And one time, Alicia, there was a time in my life when I was sort of struggling and I spent a lot of time working on myself. And in that time, I was meditating a lot. And this sort of method came to me at one point, not the podcast, but these underlying principles. And one of those was simplify, right? Simplify. So I keep hearing these words simplify. So for me, the Podcast ATM model over time, it's moved from like at the beginning, it was like 5 different steps to now where it's just 3. And every podcaster, every podcast guester, if we want to call that a guester, they can understand this, right? But there's a way to do it, right? So each pillar of this is, we call it our audience attraction method. Then we have our irresistible opt-in offer framework. And then we have our sales without selling system on the back end. So it's really just those 3 main pillars where it's growing your audience, whether as a guest or a host, moving people from, you'll like this, listener to lead, right? And then having a place in the process that they can become a client of yours, a customer and a client through community and through other things we do on the back end. But it's a very natural way of doing it. And the way I like to do it, I look at it as a relationship pathway. But it's also, for those I want to clarify too, it's a one-to-many business model. So as the entrepreneur, you're not bringing guests on to sell them your services. You're actually changing the lives of your listeners and bringing them into your world and creating programs that bring, where they self-select generally when they come through the system that we build. And I like to always say, you're going to accelerate revenue when you accelerate relationships. And that's the whole process. It's designed to do that through each one of those steps. And we do it a little bit different. So I'm happy to sort of break down that each one a little bit more if you want me to.
I love that you mentioned the point of this is not you are a service provider and you maybe need 5 clients every month recurring to make your income like those are not necessarily, it may work in some way, right? There may be some strategies, but the kind of pyramid, the steps that you're kind of taking your audience through and that you're describing are definitely a one-to-many, and which means that your strategies and your goals of your podcast are going to be very different. So you may have more of solo episodes so that you show up as the expert of your podcast. We talked about this before. Just want to reiterate it. Those goals have to be tied in the strategies that you're implementing around your content, around your marketing. You have to reach a broader audience. And it's important. We've talked about this before as well. I mean, we're at like over 100 episodes now. We've talked about it before. When you want to grow your podcast, make sure you're a guest. So if you are someone who's looking to do one-to-many as a listener, then implement these things that Evan's going to show us and tell us about. And also make sure that you are being a guest on other people's podcasts to broaden your scopes while also using these strategies. So I just want to make sure that we keep that in mind as you go through each of these, that yes, it's great to use these for our podcast, but also keeping it in the back of our heads that as this is a one-to-many strategy, also implementing it in our podcast guesting. So let's go ahead and start with the first one.
Oh, I love that too. And I'm so aligned with what you said there. Because, to me, I often tell people, look at the bigger picture instead of bringing the guests. And I'm like you, that I'm not here to say this is bad, this is good. But for us, what worked for us in our podcast was selling with the guest. It was like creating relationships that created JV partnerships and collaborations later. And that sort of goes a little bit sidetracked, but I just wanted to bring that up because I like to share with people. It's like, sometimes you might be, if like I use this analogy, if the fruit's laying on the ground and it's really easy just to pick it up, it may not be the best piece of fruit. It might have a little like bad places on it, right? You're doing better to have to like work to bring the ladder out, put it up against the tree, put in a little effort, and it could be more abundance for everybody. So just to clarify that too, but I love what you said because I'm fully aligned with that. So for us, what I like to share with people, because we were known for the growth of our podcast, which is very organic when we grew our audience. And that's why we have this unique method around growing, because I didn't know what I was doing when I started doing this, to be honest with you. I just started looking at what I knew how to do and brought that into the podcasting space. And so the first step that I would tell people, and I'll cover each one of these like really high level, but give your listeners something that they can really take, some meat and potatoes, like my former partner, Pat, used to like to say. Focus on evergreen organic growth. Look for ways to create once that delivers 24/7, 365. And you mentioned one, and that's podcast guesting. Getting on the right shows to grow your show is one way, but there's other ways to do it. Obviously, YouTube is organic. So many people feel like they have to post nonstop on social media, but that you have no control over that. And it's out there once and then disappears. And I'm one of these analogy picture guys. I don't know if it's from my background or what, but I like to say with our strategy, instead of having a styrofoam cup full of holes that you're trying to fill all the time to grow your podcast, it's like having a glass where you keep pouring it and it hits the top. And you've created all this evergreen content all over for lack of better terms, this online real estate space, and it just overflows. And all of a sudden your listenership takes off. But we also used SEO in a different way than what most people may think of, where SEO, a lot of people think of it as like on the podcast itself in the headline, in the description, all that's great. But we would actually because I came from a content marketing space, so we took SEO outside of the podcast. We were proactive about getting in front of our ideal listeners with written content. And then we would embed the podcast player, not a link, the actual player, right in that content so they could listen immediately. And we actually designed a strategy for this where we didn't want you to read the article. We just wanted to hook you with that headline, give you some curiosity right immediately and say, hey, if you want to hear all of this, listen right now. And it would pull listeners in. But that lives out online 24/7, 365. So the more you do this, it's like taking a little extra work up front. It pays off massively on the back end. So that was part of like how to grow our audience. The second phase, when it comes to getting people from listener to lead, what I've discovered over time, and it took me teaching, like we were sharing earlier, I discovered more and more that we were known because we actually had a 78.6% opt-in rate from when listeners came over to get into our world. And it was crazy. You know, we couldn't believe it. We didn't even know what we were doing, how we did it, but it worked. But what we really did was we followed our heart. We over-delivered and gave a lot. And we wanted to make sure that we were building a relationship, not just creating a transaction to get the email address. So that's a real key. But for us, what I discovered over time is it starts in your content. So this goes back to your other question around content. As a solo podcaster, who's an entrepreneur who's trying to get content out there, what we discovered is if you help create transformational content that shifts someone's identity, that helps them create a new identity, that overcomes some false beliefs, creates a compelling future, and then says, hey, to get towards that future, all you got to do is take the next step over here and we'll help you out with that. And that's how you create the desire for them to opt in to your thing. So that's a real high level thing. But just for your listeners who are listening, think about all the clients you talk to, all the prospects you talk to. Think about all the objections that come up, all the reasons why they can't achieve what they wish to achieve. Well, all these things they tell you. Now create stories and content that help them overcome that in your episodes. And the natural next step is now they're like ready to come over here and they get on your list and they move into your flow. And for us also, what's really cool about it is you're sort of creating your dream client because you're helping them be who they need to be before they even get to do the thing they wish to do, before they even join your program. So they're likely to be more successful, which is really awesome. And then the third phase of it is we call it the sales without selling, because we quit selling, because we have a process in place when they come into our world, that relationship and the way that we have something we call a niche cast that we've created that is unlike what a lot of people, I don't think I've seen anybody else doing this, but it's like a private audio sort of journey. I call it a lead experience that takes them through where they self-select and say, I want to work with you. And one of my clients just recently did this where she was like, Evans, I did what you said to do. I just went out there and created this thing and put people into it that I knew had sort of been in my world for a while and said, hey, go try this thing. And they got to the end of it and they were reaching out to me going, what's next? How can I work with you? And she was like, it was so cool. There were just no convincing, no selling. They were actually asking me, how can I give you money? And I'm like, exactly. That's the real fun part of it. So you end up working with people that you absolutely love to work with, people that are ready to be successful. And that in turn, as if you're a serve first entrepreneur, makes you feel good because it's like you want people to succeed, but then they become your best partners because they start referring people into your world. So the whole thing is designed, one, from the listener first, like how can I remove barriers to their success? How can I build a relationship? And how can I make it effortless for them to move from point A to point Z? And then just say, I want to work with you. And what we discovered was, from our experience, when our list, the one that we had 78.6% opt-in, when we use this system, 80% of our best clients, the ones that spent the most, that bought again and again, that ascended to our higher programs, that referred business to us, they all came from that list. And it was really, really cool. I like to share with people too. It's like, it sounds all pretty now when you do it, but you just have to, the biggest lesson I learned through this process was, one, we didn't really know what we were doing as we were doing it, but we listened to our heart and to our intuition and tried to find a thing that worked for us based on principles from other successful coaches and people that had been ahead of us. But we weren't going to be copycats because we tried that and it was killing our business and we weren't being successful. So when we took the principles of what we're working and then thought, how can we make it our own? How can it come from us? then everything changed. And it was just almost like it's like an overnight success that was not an overnight success. We've all heard that story before.
You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together. Yes. These are so good. Going back to that first one of making sure that your content is evergreen and what you're creating is kind of what I like to call a circle of information for your audience, right? You can take them from social media to your blog, to your YouTube, to your podcast. And you kind of just, I hate this word because I grew up in a cult, but indoctrinate them in some way in your message of awesomeness, right? It's not weird. And like give them information in a way that it works no matter where or when they're listening to it. And so when you mentioned embedding it into a blog post, I mean, you're talking very basic things that people can do in maybe making your show notes a little beefier with the SEO strategy. Throw that on your website. These are very practical things that you can do that are going to help you with a podcast, especially if the content that you're creating is evergreen, which is very important when it comes to podcast episodes, because podcast listeners are bingers and they want to go through and listen to all of them. So you got to make sure that it's relevant no matter when or where someone is listening. That second one on the content side and like what you're actually talking about, I have this example that I want to share where we have a client where she has the quickest episodes. They are very topical, down and dirty. This is how you can make a change in your life from point A to point B. And it tends to be around boundaries, which we all need, right? So around the holidays, she'll have episodes on creating boundaries with your family. And so that is such a quick and easy way. She gives scripts, she gives templates, she gives examples. And then the people who go and listen to her podcast, they're like, yes, sign me up. I want your help. I need your help. It is so easy for her to get on a call with someone and say, and this is a 1 to fewer, right? So this strategy can still work with if you're maybe doing group programs or you're maybe working with a few clients. I mean, at most, I believe she has anywhere from 5 to 9 clients that she wants to work with in a month. So very few clients for her. But it's so easy for, especially if they are podcast listeners, they sell themselves on her stuff. They're like, I don't even need you to tell me what it's included. Just here's my credit card. Take my money. I want to work with you. And that's because she is making those changes for her listeners right out of the gate. And I think that's so important. Then that third one, the sales without selling. So I am curious about some of the behind the scenes of that. You mentioned kind of like an audio journey. What does that look like for, listeners who maybe and how I'm imagining it, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, is that someone subscribes to your email list because they've got your opt-in and you're kind of giving them a sequence of emails or a sequence of transformational information. And then they get to the end and they want to work with you. But is there maybe I'm missing something in there.
No, it's the same. It's similar to what you're sharing, but this is actually, I started thinking about it, right? And we call these niche casts because they're niched down to whatever, you know best what needs to be in this is what I'll say. And then I'll sort of go over that as the entrepreneur. But I started thinking about it because when I look back at everything that we did, I sort of tried to figure out why was this working? Why is this working? Right. Like we have something called the no opt-in method where we use texting instead of just sending them to a landing page, because I was thinking like, what's going to make it easier for that listener? right? Why are we always putting up barriers as the entrepreneur? It's like we should start looking at this the way Apple looks at how they create their products, right? What's the user experience? Not like, what do I want you to do? Which I think is what most entrepreneurs look at. Like, I want you to get on my list. I want you to book a call. I want you to, right? And it's like, no, what did they want? So with that, you said binge, which I love because that's part of it, is I started thinking, okay, one, if listeners love to binge on content and they're podcast listeners, they've already raised their hand and say, this is what I like to do. I like to listen to audio. Why are we trying to give them an ebook instead of giving them what they want? So what we do is we work with our clients to develop this like 5 to 8 episode private podcast, audio course, whatever you want to call it. I like to think of it as an audio journey for the listener. And you start with, I'll ask my clients this. Is it okay if I just share like a little bit of the down and dirty?
Yes, I love it. This is so great.
I'll ask my clients directly. I'm like, okay, what is it that you wish them to buy into? What program? Is it your high ticket offer, high ticket group coaching, mastermind? Okay, great. We know what the end result is. Now we back it up. It's like, what is something that prevents people from joining that or being successful with that? When you get on calls with people, what are you hearing all the time? Like objections or anything like that? And like one of my clients, basically these two guys that work in the almost personal development for younger men, like they have a mastermind, they're like, it's self-sabotage. So we then following a specific framework, we created these multiple episodes, like little audio podcasts. So when they opt in, instead of just getting a bunch of emails, they're actually getting access to this downloaded audio that lands right into their favorite podcast player. So it can sit, if you're a podcaster, it can sit right in their Apple podcast app right next to yours. But it basically takes them on a journey. So we follow a specific framework. But the cool thing is, Alicia, is that it gives you the opportunity, like after they finish, let's say episode 1, they get through it at the end, you're like, okay, here's 5 things that you can do to take what you just learned here and implement into your life. Shoot me an email once you implement that and let me know what happens, or shoot me an email if you have any questions about that, or DM me on Instagram, however you like to communicate. So it opens the door for a 2-way conversation, but it's not a selling conversation. It's a serving conversation, right? And you can do this on multiple episodes. So then at the end, you can actually we've actually done it where they get to, let's say it's a 6-episode series. At episode 4, we'll throw in a thing like, hey, I'd love to give you a 15-minute call to go over what you've learned so far and see if I can give you some pointers to get better results from it. And once again, it's not a selling opportunity. It's a serving opportunity. So it takes a little bit of different train of thought, but a lot of the people that I work with, the way that they approach their business and they approach their life, they love this. And then at the end, we'll often say, hey, now that I see, you're an action taker. You did this whole thing, Alicia. I've loved seeing your feedback. I'd love to give you a 30-minute strategy call or whatever you want to call it. You can let them know. This is what I always tell people, though. I'm like, don't play the game where it's like, oh, it's just a discovery call. It's not let them know like, hey, on this call, I'm just going to let you know ahead of time. I'm going to offer you the opportunity to see what we have that's the next step. And if it's a good fit, then cool. If not, no worries. Yeah. Sort of like real laid back, because I don't believe in closing, convincing, any of that stuff. It's just enrolling. And what I've discovered, I told my wife this the other day because I did a training the other day and I was like, this is how I know it's a good training. This is how I know if it's working. When they actually like, do you have any questions for me? And it's like, that's the first time you ask them that question. They're like, oh yeah, I do have a question. Like, when does the program start? You're like, oh my gosh, was the training that good? I feel like I've done, and that makes everybody happy, because what it tells me is that in that goal of moving them one step closer in this niche cast, it's about transforming. It's about overcoming maybe a false belief, 1 or 2. It's about helping them move closer to that aspirational future that they have, but now believing they can actually achieve it where they may not have believed it before, because you're overcoming some of those false beliefs in that little niche cast, the audio version of it. And it's designed, to me, that there's a very important principle behind this. And then I'll jump and let you ask me any other questions that you want to around it. But I read this in a book called Oversubscribed by Daniel Priestley. And there's scientific research that shows, and this is great for podcasters, for one. This is why I love it. If someone spends 7 hours with you and they have 11 interactions, so it can be like an email, a message, whatever, in 4 different locations. So like you mentioned, your circle, it could be your written content, it could be your Facebook group, it could be your podcast, whatever. If they do that 7-11-4, at that point, you have created such a deep human connection and emotional bond with that person that they are probably not going to ever leave your world unless something crazy happens, right? So to me, my process was like, how do we stop trying to get attention and how do we hold the attention? And if they're listening to our podcast and they're building up the hours over there, let's move them into a binge-able lead gen experience where we can create multiple interactions and more time with them to quickly, because the faster you can pull them into your world and create that 7-11-4, the better you are, because we know there's like so many different things flying at us all the time, distracting us. So that's sort of the deeper thought process behind it.
I am obsessed with all of this. And I think why I love it so much is that it's not about a numbers game. It's not about selling. It really is like everything that you're describing is about serving, because you can take those interactions and those responses to that email sequence and that audio sequence for future podcast content, right? So like there's different ways that we can use all of these interactions that we're having with these people. And even on that end, sales call, right? Like call it what it is. Even at that end sales call, you can still take that and say, look, if we don't work together, that's fine. That person is going to remember that. I have been on calls before where either the person was very dismissive because I wasn't their ideal client, or they were like trying to really hard sell me. And I was like, no, I'm not taking out a credit card loan to work with you. I'm sorry, not sorry. Like, no, I'm not ready at this point. If they had approached it from a different standpoint, a year, 6 months, 3 months even later, I might have said, you know what, I really want to work with this person. They were very kind. They were loving. They didn't care about me as a sales point. They cared about me as a person. I mean, we've all been there before, right? On both of sides of that. And so what you're describing is that selling from a place of serving and giving content from a place of serving your audience, rather than being like, all right, you need to buy this. You need to buy this. I'm the only one that knows how to give you this information. Going back to that first point of creating content that can be transformational. We don't have to hold all of it to ourselves. We don't have to hide our secret sauce. They're not going to be able to make those big jumps without us and without working with us, right? They can still make those incremental changes though. And that is so, so important. I love it. Is there anything else that you feel that we should add at this point? I feel like you've given so much value to the audience up to here.
No, I so align with everything you're saying too. And I think one of the things that I want to make sure people don't miss, and I heard this on one of your other podcasts, which I actually had a little aha moment when we were talking about reviews in a membership area. We always build in the community aspect as well, because as you were talking about the circle, I think of it as like an ecosystem. So no matter where they come in to your world, they may come into like your community on Facebook and then find your podcast, or they may come find your podcast, go through the lead journey, not be ready yet, but then, hey, make sure you stick around and I tell people, I like, come be a part of the community. You're going to get so much free training. It's going to blow you away. So we always include the community element, because I think one thing that at least I'm noticing now, and you may be noticing it too, is that more and more people, they're looking for that connection, that real connection to other people that are like-minded, where it makes this whole online space feel a little more intimate and real versus just electronic, right? It's not like I go back to the beginning. It's like quit focusing on transactional things and focus on the relationship, and it'll change everything. So we always build that into our ecosystem as well. It's like, hey, we got the community, we have the podcast, we have the lead gen system, and then we have our programs. So you can join those, but if not, you'll get a lot of value. Continue listening to the show, right? Because what what is better? I tell people this to them all the time. I'm like, if you want to grow your show and get it to a level where it continues to grow effortlessly, the best thing you can do is take care of your listeners that are already listening and make sure that you're not always chasing new ones, right? Like just keep that foundation. And it's the same thing as pouring the water in the cup. Eventually, when it hits that top, it's going to overflow. And then everything else is just abundance for everybody, right? So if I could give anybody a takeaway, it's a lot of what you said too. It's like focus on treating others the way you'd want to be treated and start thinking of your listeners as actual humans, not just a download number. Don't look at your lead generation as give me that email address and I'll give you this thing. Think of it as like, hey, I'm starting a real relationship that's going to help that person and give them really something that's tangible that they can take in their life and get a change. And they will, like you mentioned earlier, they'll come rushing at you with their credit cards out like I'm ready to buy. And I'll give a real world example, then I'll throw it back to you. But we went to an event, a big event one time, myself and my partner. I was like the guy behind the curtain. I was building this whole machine while he was just the expert who was great at what he did. It was called Real Estate Rock Stars with Pat Hyben was the name of the podcast. It's still out there. It's under a different name because the business was actually sold. Because what I do is we built a business model, not just a podcast, right? So it was sold, but we were at this event and I remember sitting at this big round table, like at lunch, and there were like these three guys that kept sort of staring over at us. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? Then Pat gets up, goes to get a drink, refill his drink. And this guy comes over and starts asking me questions like, is that Pat Hyben? Like he's some kind of rock star, right? Or something, right? So I introduced him. But the point of this is that the guy looked at us and we were having this conversation. We're standing there talking, his two buddies and myself and Pat. And he's like, man, I opted in to your free lead gen thing. And I got in there and I took something that you gave me. I went out, implemented it into my business. I closed my biggest commission ever on a listing and made like $5,000. He's like, $5,000 from a free thing. He's like, who does that? And he did this. He pulls out his wallet, starts pulling out his credit card. He's like, I heard y'all talking about your new program that you had because we were introducing this new higher ticket program. He's like, I've got my credit card. Can I go in and sign up? And we're like, we're not even like close to being ready yet, but you will be the first person in the program when we launch it, and he was, which was really cool. But so what you're sharing to your listeners, I want them to hear and see it's like, this really happens when you do it the right way as a podcaster. People absolutely start to feel like they know you. And if you can create that know, like, and trust on a deeper level and actually come from a place of service and start to transform their lives, then you're going to have a fan for life and somebody that's going to want to either push people to your business or they're going to be a part of your business one way or the other.
Yes, that celebrity effect of podcasting. I like to call it the celebrity effect where, I have met people at podcasting conferences where I fangirl and I am so embarrassed because I fangirl hard because I'm like, I've been listening to your podcast for like 7 years. Oh my God. Can we take a picture? And the picture's shaky because I'm like so excited. Yeah. Been there, done that, guys. It's fine. But we've all been there, right? Like there's this podcaster that if we were to meet them, we would feel like, wait, is that person? Oh my goodness. So I love that you brought that up because that celebrity effect through podcasting when you're giving value is so powerful. Thank you so much, Evans. This has been so impactful. And like you said, full of meat and potatoes. So I feel like people can take even one thing from this episode and really make a difference with their show and get more clarity. So where can people find you, get to know you, hang out with you?
Well, yeah. Is it okay if I give them like a little freebie if they want it? I've got I talked about our niche cast. If they want to actually download a blueprint and see what it's like, I'm in the process of actually creating the audio version now, but you can go start building your own. I've created this thing. You can text the word leads to 55444 and it'll actually give you instant access to it. Or you can go to podcastsalesmachine.com/leads and download that, but highly recommend it. Just start implementing it. I put as much detail as I could into it. So it wasn't one of these things like you got to have me to finish the project. It's like, I hope I've spelled it out enough and giving you the step-by-step that you can take it and run with it. So I would tell your listeners, go grab that, because if you're a podcaster or a guest, it'll change your business. That, and then if you ever want to come check out Podcast Profit School, we just launched that, and it's fun place, great community, collaborative folks. You and I both know, Alicia, how cool the podcasting space is and the entrepreneurs in podcasting. So that's over at podcastprofitschool.com. You can come check that out too as well.
Thank you so much, Evans. We'll make sure that we have links for all of that, as well as what to text, the text number, and what to text to that number in the show notes, as well as on the blog post, to ensure that anyone who's driving or may not able to text it right now can get that at a later date. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.